When it comes to coral reef aquariums, all light is not good light, and in today's video we're going to try to break down what makes a light good and why we need to do certain things with a little bit of science in the back without getting too overbearing. Let's talk about it. So why is lighting even important for us and for our corals in our reef tanks? Well, pretty much lighting, along with chemistry, and we're going to talk about that in a little while, but lighting is the primary source of energy for our corals, and their health and welfare and survivability ultimately comes down to what lights we have over our tanks. And our lights are not going to affect just the health and survivability of the corals, it is also going to affect the growth of the corals and the coloration to a huge degree, and we're going to talk about that more towards the end. So let's get started and begin to understand some of the basics. Corals have a symbiotic relationship with another organism that lives within their own tissues, and these guys are called zooxanthellae. Now these little guys, the zooxanthellae, they harvest this light and they use it through photosynthesis to create their own energies, and then their waste export products that they output after photosynthesis are what literally feeds our corals. It's pretty interesting that corals themselves don't actually perform the photosynthesis at all. It's these little guys that live within their tissues doing all the work. And it's because of that that lighting is not the only concern here. We need to have good water parameters as well, because certain microtrace elements like molybdenum and manganese and zinc and boron all play a role inside photosynthesis, that whole process whereby they take that light and create it to energy. Molybdenum is heavily used in the creation of chlorophyll A and also chlorophyll C, which we'll talk about in a minute, and manganese and boron and zinc are used up in the uptake of nitrogenous things for these bacteria to use during this whole process. So these are very important. And you know, one of the best ways to make sure that you always have a little bit of this stuff in your tank? Water changes. I bet you didn't expect me to tie water changes in to the lighting of our aquariums. And if I got you off guard, hit that like button. That was a good one. So at this point, we know that we have to have light, and it's used for photosynthesis, and it's because of the little guys living within the tissues. It would be very similar to us having a tapeworm who consumed the food that we ate, and then the tapeworm's waste is what fueled our bodies. That's kind of how that would work if we were corals. Thank God we're not. Which brings us to the question of what kind of lights do we need? Full spectrum, or should we be running those lights that are so extremely blue it's hard to look at? Let's talk about that. First off, let's get one thing out of the way right now. Full spectrum lighting, where it spans the range and it's more of a white coloration than that bright blue coloration, is absolutely not needed for coral growth. However, there's a caveat here that full spectrum lighting is beneficial to coral growth and overall health in the long run. And when we start talking about these lights in this blue and white range, I need you to understand that there's a spectrum of light here. All light, all colors of light are used to make up white light. White light really isn't a thing. It's made up of all the other colors of the rainbow. But for our intents and purposes on our lights, there's usually a white channel, and that is made up of everything from about 500 nanometers and up to about 700 or 800 or whatever. It's all the yellows and oranges, reds and teals and greens and all that stuff. And on this same spectrum of lighting, what our corals are going to use the most for their photosynthesis processes and growth and all that stuff is anywhere from the 500s and down to about 380, which, conveniently enough, are the blue spectrums and the UV spectrum. But everything from about 380 up to about 600, which is all the way into the reds, can be used to do some part of the photosynthetic process. Chlorophyll A is mainly responsible for most of the photosynthesis that happens within our corals. And that peak photosynthesis takes place down around 450 nanometers, which is quite blue, getting into the UV spectrum of things. But chlorophyll C can use spectrums up in around the 600 range. Now, these are the reds, the dark oranges and red spectrums. They take that energy from that dark red spectrum and they convert it into some other stuff. And then they channel that over to the chlorophyll A, which uses it further and creates further energy for the corals. So it's pretty easy to see that if you combine chlorophyll A and chlorophyll C's results, the net result you're going to get from all the photosynthesis is more energy than if you were to just do photosynthesis with chlorophyll A alone. This is why a lot of the LED lighting manufacturers now still include the red and green spectrums of light in their lighting setups. Now, Pop Bloom has decided not to do that. They've taken the red LEDs out and they've included more blue and UV LEDs for that peak photosynthesis phase. Personally, I'm okay with that. And here's why. Too much of that spectrum up around the 600 nanometer range, that yellow, orange, and red spectrum, is perfect for growing something else that we don't want in our tanks, nuisance algae. Now, some people will tell you that white light doesn't cause algae, and while that's generally true, there are extenuating factors like your nutrients probably need to either be out of balance or high. I get that. I understand. But I don't want to make that situation easier for them just in case my nutrients get a little bit out of whack. I'm blasting the tank with the spectrum of lighting that algae loves to thrive in. Now, that's my personal opinion. I'm not telling you to run your tank that way or that you can or can't run your tank that way. I'm telling you why I'm running mine the way that I am. I've been battling a ridiculous algae problem. I took my nitrates all the way down to 1 ppm and my phosphates down to 0.01 and held them there for 2 months. And it finally started helping get rid of this crazy freaking algae that I have. So I didn't want to fuel that with any extra light from any spectrum from any universe anywhere. I got a little off topic there, so let's rein it back in, right? So basically what I'm getting at here is this is why the industry has shifted a little bit more towards our lights being in those bluer spectrums than they used to be, with our lights being in the more whiter and less blue kind of spectrums going on. Now, you can still run a full spectrum of lighting like what I have going on behind me right here. This is very white. It's probably a little more blue on the camera, but it's very white to my eye. And that's the key that I want to make right now. You need to use the white spectrums on your lights for your visual appeal in your tank. Use that slider, if you can, on your lights to make the tank look good to you during the 2 to 3 or maybe 4 hours of peak viewing time in your space, wherever your space might be. For me, I'm home all day long right now, so I chose to sort of mimic nature kind of as closely as I could, and I have my whites coming up to a peak at about noon, lasting till about 4 o'clock, which is pretty similar to what nature does with the sun. My point here is this is completely your call. You can run whatever percentage of whites you want to run, but if you start running into algae problems, you might have to dial those whites back a little bit. Now, another point that this brings up with the different spectrums and the different manufacturers of lighting is your corals could look differently at the store or at your house or at my house, depending on what wavelength of light your particular lights put out and at what power. I could take a coral out of my tank, bring it to your house and put it under your lights, and it's going to look completely different under your lighting system than it will under mine if we have a different lighting system, for lack of a better term. A perfect example is if you go to one of your local fish stores and it's a very nice store, they might have something like those $1,000 Radion fixtures over their coral tanks. And the colors that they're getting from those fixtures are just absolutely insane. The corals are popping, but when you bring that coral home, it's not nearly as bright and vibrant and fluorescent as it was at the store. It's literally down to the power of the individual wavelengths that the different lights output. And here's a prime example in my own tank. This picture was taken under white lighting without any filters or anything like that. It's basically just the white channel was at 90%, The UV blues and other channels were down around 20%, and I was able to get this image. This is the exact same coral, but with the white and the teal lights turned off and the UV and blue lights turned all the way up. You can see that these spectrums make the colors of the corals just absolutely pop so much more. And it's literally just down to the spectrum. Now, don't get me wrong. Trace element concentration in your tank is also hugely responsible for coral coloration and what you have going on. But we're just talking about lighting right now. So lighting itself does have an effect on colors. The spectrum is not the only thing that we're worried about. There are lights out there that have the correct spectrum for corals, but they're just simply not powerful enough to get the job done. Consider this. You have a 5 horsepower internal combustion engine. You know those little like go-kart engines or lawnmower engines or whatever? It's still an internal combustion engine. It'll still make something with wheels move if you hook it up correctly, and it still uses either gas or diesel as fuel to do all of its operations, just like a big V8 engine would in a pickup truck. But if you put that little lawnmower engine in that pickup truck, it's not powerful enough to do the job that that truck is going to be trying to do. Even though it's still an internal combustion engine inside a pickup truck, it's just not going to get the job done because it doesn't have enough grunt. Our lighting is exactly the same way. We can have that spectrum and not have enough power, and our corals won't look good, they won't color up, and they won't grow, and they may not even survive. This light is an exact example of that. Now, I have nothing personally against this company. I use many of their products. I'm just using this light as an example that it has the full spectrum of light that we would like to be able to use in our aquariums, but at 14 watts, it's just not powerful enough. It's really hard for me to give you a guideline about how many watts per gallon or anything like that you want to go by. And here's what I would say. Any aquarium that's like a 20-gallon cube or larger, you're going to want at least 50 watts of lights per 2 foot by 2 foot area of space on that aquarium. So like a 20-gallon cube, you could run something like a Nicrew 50 watt or a Pop Bloom 60 watt or some other light that is equivalent to that. You could run a little more, but I wouldn't recommend that you would run much less because you're not going to get the power out of that light that you need for the corals to do what it needs to do. Now, there are some exceptions to needing that much power, like this candy jar tank that I have put together and also my wine glass aquarium. I have a Delua 20 watt pixel over the wine glass aquarium, and I have a Haiger 30 watt light over the candy jar tank. But the corals and the macroalgae in these two tanks are sometimes mere inches away from the light. So there's enough power that close to the light for these things to be okay. But that's pretty much the only situation that low amount of power is going to be enough to get the job done. So we need to talk about how do we know where in the tank to place certain corals so that they get the amount of light that they need or they don't need. And to do that, we have to discuss PAR, and there's another acronym that you need to at least know about called PUR, P-U-R. So when we talk about spectrums and we talk about power and when we talk about lighting, we're literally discussing PAR, which is photosynthetically active radiation. It's the literal photons of light that are coming down from the lighting fixture and bouncing off of your corals, either being absorbed or reflected back into our eyeballs. PUR, P-U-R, is passively usable radiation. And when we're talking about coral coloration and photosynthesis and stuff, that's really what we're talking about, is what percentage or what mixture of these spectrums and power can the corals actually be using for photosynthesis. Unfortunately, that goes spectrum by spectrum and requires deep, heavy analysis and a spectrometer to be able to even get within the realm of being correct. So we use a little less technological device, a PAR meter, and we're able to get a pretty close reading for where our corals are going to be good. Recently in a video, I pitted the Dano Plus PAR meter that you can get on Amazon for about 150 bucks, there's a link in the description, against the king of PAR meters for us in this hobby, the Apogee or Apogee or Apogee, whatever, if MQ510. And we found that the Dano Plus was actually pretty darn accurate, although it needed a corrective factor. So if you're looking for a cheap option to at least get a range of where you need to be in your aquarium and get your lights set, maybe that's a good choice for you. Check that video out and make up your mind on your own. But when we're talking about corals, we basically can break these down into three different categories. We can go with softies and we can go with LPS and SPS. Now, I know that's very general and sort of all-encompassing, but for our purposes in setting the par range in our tank, we're pretty good. You want to set your tank up where you have about 50 to 75 par at the sand bed and go up from there pretty much as high as you can go. But we're pretty limited in being able to distinguish differences with our lighting. We can't tell our lights 50 at the sand bed and 400 at the top of the rocks. It just kind of happens. So we have to set our lights at some middle of the ground, middle of the road sort of situation that's going to give us the best overall par in the entire tank with that range of 50 to 400 or so from the sand to the top of the rocks. And what we do is we can measure different places in the aquarium, find different par values, and take a screenshot or write those down or make some notes or something like that that you can refer back to later. And so we go to the store, we bring this coral home, and it's an XYZ thing. We look it up on TitleGardens.com because that's a really good repository for coral care information. Make a note of that. TitleGardens.com. So we look it up on there, and that says that this coral did best for them in a medium par zone. So medium par is going to be around 200, something like that. And we do look back at our notes and okay, well, right here at the edge of this cave, I was getting 190 par. So you can put that coral there, and you know that your coral is going to be getting an adequate amount of light to sustain everything that it needs to do. Now, your soft corals, you're going to be able to do anywhere from 50 up to about 100, maybe a little more depending on what coral it is. Your LPS generally like a range from about 100 up to about 300, maybe 350, depending on what they are. And your SPS, depending on the species, is going to like anywhere from 250 up to 400, and sometimes maybe more than that. There are some anemones that love light. They just want all of it. And I've even heard of some people running Acropora tanks as high as 2,000 par at the surface of the water, which seems absolutely crazy to me, and I would not try that. Which brings me to my next point. You like how I tie these things together, huh? Common mistakes that you need to avoid when lighting your aquarium. And the first one is going to be referencing what I just spoke about, overpowering your lights on your tank. It is massively worse of a situation to overpower your tank than it is to run your lights a little too weak. Too much par can cook a sensitive coral in just a few hours, but too little light is going to take days or weeks or sometimes even several weeks to really show up and present that problem to you, in which case you can fix it and then let it repair itself slowly over time. But if you put a coral that doesn't like 400 par up in the 400 range, it could kill that coral in just a couple of hours. So starting conservatively on the low end and then bringing things up over time is definitely the way to go when you're trying to acclimatize your coral to your aquarium, which I'm going to talk about right now in 2 seconds, or when you're putting lights on your tank and maybe you're swapping fixtures or something. You always want to start low if you don't have a par meter and bring them up over time. Now, I mentioned acclimatizing your corals, and this is a pretty general thing. It's the way that I like to start with. I look up whatever the coral needs from a par standpoint, be it low, medium, or high, and I start that coral at the next jump down in my tank. So if I bring home a coral that is a medium light coral, I'm going to start it right down almost on the sand bed because I know that it's not going to be getting too much par in that zone. And then after a couple of days, if it's looking good, I'll raise it up 3 or 4 inches and I'll give it a couple more days. And if it's still looking good, I'll raise it up 3 or 4 more inches. And I keep doing this until I get it into that zone where I know that it's going to be happy and good for the rest of its life. Now, we could do a whole video on how you acclimatize corals to your aquarium and stuff like that, but we'll save that for another day. Most of you probably want to know is, what lighting schedule should I be looking at? How long should I have things on? And how much percentage of what should I be doing? Before I tell you sort of the main idea, I want to make this point that every tank is different. It's going to depend on what animals you have in your tank, what corals you have in your tank, what colorations you have, your nutrient load, and all of that stuff. But in general, you're going to want to be running your lights for a maximum amount of time from start to finish for about 10 hours a day. You could go to 11 or you could drop to 9, that's fine, but somewhere in that sort of 8 to 11 hours a day total time on all light is the guideline for the amount of time. Now, I personally like to have my lights ramp up in intensity and ramp down in intensity, and I include that ramp inside the total time because the lights are on, photons are hitting the coral. Might not be many at the beginning and at the end, but they're there. So within that 8 or 10 hours a day, you can break up your lighting into something that I call the 80-20 rule. 80% of your intensity from your lights should be from your bluer spectrums, and 20% of the intensity from your lights in the whiter spectrums. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is completely up to you. That's just sort of what I tend to run over the years. It's worked well for me, and it's worked well for a lot of other people as well. I tend to break this down a little bit more even, and with the ramps that are available and the scheduling that's available with the modern lights that we have, I run something like this. So it's kind of variable throughout the day. It sort of mimics nature a little bit. Depending on your lights, you may or may not have this much controllability. But the point that I'm making here is it's roughly 80 to 20. I have mine set up what's pleasing to me and what I think might do well with the corals that I have in my tank. And ultimately, that's what you should do too. So listen, there was a ton of information in this video. I hit a lot of different topics. I hope that I was clear for you, but if not, drop a comment down below and I will do my best to clarify any confusion that you might have. My goal with this video was to give you an understanding of what's going on, not an exact timeline to follow with the lighting on your tanks. So I hope that I have accomplished that. If I did, you know what to do, and then watch this video on screen right now. You're going to find that one pretty interesting.